The Alpha Mafia CEO was dying, only an Omega cleaner could save him. Nobody warned Evan that the night he almost quit his job would be the night the most dangerous Alpha in Korea grabbed his wrist and refused to let go. The armored car door swings open at 6:47 p.m. Evan doesn't look up. He never looks up. That's the first rule of surviving 8 months at jail tower without anyone learning what he is. Keep your head down. Push the cart. Disappear into the uniform. But then he smells it. Not cologne. Not power. Something older than both. Something raw and iron dark bleeding through the evening air like a wound the expensive suit couldn't hide. He looks up. Han Lee, CEO of Jail Group, rumored architect of half of Seoul's underground, a man whose name other alphas lower their voices to say, is braced against his own car door like it's the only thing holding him upright. One massive hand pressed flat to his chest. Jaw clenched. Eyes fighting to stay open. And then those eyes find Evan. Not his supervisor. Not the security detail 2 meters away. Evan. The cleaner with the mop cart and the expired coffee still in his pocket. Han pushes off the car. Takes 1 step. 2. And presses a blood-red access card directly into Evan's frozen hand, fingers curling around Evan's like a lock clicking shut. Only you, he rasps. Don't run. Then Han Lee, the most feared alpha in Korea, crumples to the ground. Evan stands there, card burning in his grip, heart slamming against his ribs, and thinks, I should drop this. Walk away. Pretend I never touched it. He doesn't walk away. That single moment of hesitation is about to cost Evan everything he spent 4 years carefully building, his anonymity, his safety, his carefully suppressed designation, and hand him the one thing he never thought he deserved. A reason to stop erasing himself. This is the story of 2 men the world wrote off, one for having too much power, one for having none, and what happened when a dying empire reached out in the dark and found exactly the person it needed. Evan had a system. Wake at 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the alarm, because his body had learned not to trust silence. Take the blocker with cold water, never warm. Warm water slowed the absorption and he couldn't afford slow. Fold the empty blister pack into the inside pocket of his jacket, not the trash, never the trash in his building, and leave for the bus stop before any of his neighbors opened their doors. It wasn't paranoia. It was architecture. Every piece of his morning was load-bearing. He built this life the same way other people renovate abandoned buildings, not to make something beautiful, but to make something that wouldn't collapse on top of him. The single-room apartment in Mapo had a window that faced a concrete wall and a heating unit that gave out every February without apology. He paid his rent 3 days early, kept noise below a conversation, and had never once invited anyone inside. His neighbors knew him as the quiet one on the 3rd floor. His supervisor at jail tower knew him as employee 047, evening crew, never late, never complained. Nobody knew his real name. He went by Evan Seo. Had gone by Evan Seo since he was 21, the week after he buried his father and burned the only document that connected him to the name Ryu. It wasn't grief that made him do it. It was calculation. His father had spent the last year of his life telling Evan one thing with increasing urgency: be nobody. Don't register your designation. Don't apply to the licensed Omega placement programs. Don't let anyone with institutional access pull your biological file. Evan had listened. Evan was very good at listening when the alternative was dying. The jail tower job came through a temp agency that didn't ask questions, which was the only kind of agency Evan used. Evening shift, building maintenance, floors B2 through 14. The work was invisible in the way only cleaning work can be. People looked through him the same way they looked through windows. He existed in their peripheral vision as a function, not a person. Mop. Cart. Blue uniform. Badge clipped to the left breast pocket. He had learned to find that invisibility comfortable. Some days it even felt like freedom. 8 months in, he knew the building's rhythms better than most of its employees. He knew which executive assistants worked past 9, which conference rooms were always booked by the same 4 men who never appeared on any official schedule, and he knew, because the ventilation on floor 12 pushed air directly into the east corridor where he worked Tuesdays, that Hanley's private medical team visited twice a week now instead of once. He noticed things. He just never did anything with what he noticed. That had been the deal he made with himself: observe everything, act on nothing. Stay beneath the surface tension of this world like a held breath. But the system was starting to crack. The blocker supplier he'd used for 3 years had gone dark in October. No message, no referral, just a disconnected number and a hollow feeling in Evan's chest that he refused to name. The new source charged 40% more and the tablets were a slightly different shade of white that Evan tried not to think about too hard. He'd stretched his last confirmed batch by taking them every 50 hours instead of 48, telling himself the 2-hour gap was negligible. His body disagreed. Small things, so far. A heightened sensitivity to scent that turned the chemical aisle of the convenience store into something overwhelming. A tension at the back of his throat in the elevator when other people were present. Not panic, just awareness, pulled tight as a wire. Twice in the past month he'd caught a colleague looking at him a beat too long in the break room, head slightly tilted, expression unclear. Twice he'd changed his route home. He was not afraid. Fear was a luxury for people with options. What Evan had instead was a very precise understanding of the math. If his suppression failed completely, if someone with a registered reader or even trained instincts confirmed his designation, his entire invisible life would be visible in under an hour. Jail Tower employed 4 registered alphas in senior security alone. He needed a new supplier. He needed one fast. He'd been thinking about that, only that, when he pushed his cart through the Executive Plaza side exit at 6:47 p.m. and the armored car door swung open. He hadn't looked up. Then he smelled it. And everything he'd built in 4 years began, quietly, to come apart. They didn't arrest him. That was the first surprise. Evan had stood over Hanley's unconscious body for approximately 4 seconds before the security detail that had been useless 2 minutes ago descended from every direction at once, earpieces, black jackets, hands that moved with the specific efficiency of people paid to hurt other people professionally. He'd expected to be tackled. Searched. Detained in some basement room that didn't appear on any fire safety schematic. Instead, the one who reached him first, a lean beater in a charcoal suit, maybe 35, eyes like a security camera that had developed opinions, looked at the card in Evan's hand and stopped. Just stopped. The other men stopped too. The beater's gaze moved from the card to Evan's face with the careful neutrality of someone recalculating very quickly. Then he said, quietly, "Come with me." Not a request. But not a tackle either. Evan came. His name was Kang Jizu, though he didn't offer it immediately. He walked 3 steps ahead through a corridor Evan had mopped 100 times, then turned left at a wall that Evan had always assumed was a wall, and it opened. A private elevator. Brushed steel interior, no buttons visible until Jizu pressed his thumb to a panel that materialized from nowhere, and then a floor number appeared that Evan had never seen on any directory. F21. Jail Tower had 20 floors. Evan held the card in his jacket pocket the entire ride up, fingers pressed flat against it, and said nothing. Jizu said nothing. The elevator moved without sound. The floor it opened onto was not an office. It was quiet in the way that hospitals are quiet, purposeful, loaded, the kind of silence that has monitors and measured breathing behind it. The lighting was lower than corporate standard. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something else underneath, something Evan's overtaxed senses snagged on immediately, alpha. Weakened. The particular scent signature of an alpha whose biology was under serious strain. Evan's throat tightened. He kept his face still. Jizu stopped outside a closed door, turned, and looked at him with those flat, assessing eyes. "Whatever he says to you in there," he said, "answer him directly. Don't perform. He'll know." "I'm a cleaner," Evan said. "Not a performer." Something shifted in Jizu's expression, not quite surprise, not quite respect. He opened the door. Hanley was sitting up in a medical bed that probably cost more than Evan's entire apartment building, dressed not in a hospital gown but in a dark shirt, collar open, sleeves pushed to the elbow. The informality was clearly Han's own imposition and not the medical team's preference. Evan could tell by the way the physician standing against the far wall had the expression of a man who had lost this argument multiple times. He looked worse than he had in the plaza. That shouldn't have been possible given that he'd been unconscious 20 minutes ago, but consciousness, it turned out, just made the deterioration more visible. The sharp geometry of his face was pronounced in a way that had nothing to do with aesthetics. His hands, resting on the blanket, were still. His eyes, when they found Evan, were not still at all. They were precise, focused, consuming the available information with an intensity that made Evan want to take a step back purely on instinct. He didn't take a step back. Hans said, "Your scent. I need to understand your scent." That was it. No preamble. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the fact that Evan had just been escorted to a floor that officially didn't exist after watching this man collapse onto pavement. Evan stared at him for a full 3 seconds. "I'd like to understand," Evan said, each word deliberate and level, "why a man I have never spoken to handed me a classified access card and told me not to run. Before we discuss anything about my scent." The physician went rigid. Jizu, behind Evan, made no sound. Han Li went very still. It wasn't the stillness of offense. It was something more unsettling than that, the stillness of a man who had just encountered a variable his models hadn't included. His eyes moved over Evan's face with that same consuming focus, and for a moment the medical suite held its breath. Then, almost imperceptibly, something in Han's expression shifted. Not warmth. Not yet. But attention. The real kind, the kind that didn't look through Evan like a window. The kind that looked at him like a door it hadn't yet decided whether to open. Han didn't answer Evan's question. Not directly. Instead he looked at Jizu. One glance, the economy of two people who have worked together long enough to compress entire conversations into a single look, and Jizu left the room without a word. The physician followed, with the relieved posture of someone excused from a difficult examination. The door closed. For a moment it was just the two of them, the dying Alpha and the Omega who wasn't supposed to exist, in a room that hummed with the quiet persistence of medical equipment. "Sit down," Han said. "I'll stand." Another of those silences. Han studied him with that unnerving stillness, and Evan held his ground and did not fidget and did not look away, because he had learned early that the moment you looked away from something powerful, it decided what you were worth. "You're not afraid of me," Han said. It wasn't admiration. It was data collection. "I'm afraid of plenty," Evan said. "You specifically haven't earned it yet." Han said nothing to that. But he didn't look away either. Jizu returned in 11 minutes. Evan knew because he counted. It was something he did when his body wanted to do other things, like process the alpha scent in the room that his failing blockers were no longer fully filtering. 11 minutes was enough time to pull a file that already existed. Not build one. Pull one. That told Evan something he didn't like. Jizu set a tablet on the table beside Han's bed and stepped back. Han didn't touch it. He looked at Evan. "Your name," Han said, "is not Evan Seo." The room temperature didn't change. Evan's expression didn't change. But something behind his sternum went very quiet, the way a city goes quiet in the seconds between the warning siren and the thing the siren was warning about. "My name," Evan said carefully, "is whatever is on my employment contract." "Your employment contract lists Evan Seo. Your biological registry, the one your father filed at your birth before he had the foresight to bury everything else, lists Evan Seo Ryu." Han paused. "Your father was Dr. Ryu Timin." Evan heard the name in Han's mouth and felt it land somewhere old and unprotected. He hadn't heard his father's full name spoken aloud by anyone other than himself in 3 years. He'd said it privately, occasionally, the way you press a bruise to confirm it still hurts. It still hurt. "What about him?" Evan said. Not a question. A perimeter. Han reached out and turned the tablet toward him. The file was extensive. That was the first thing that hit Evan, not any single piece of information but the sheer volume of it. His father had not been peripheral to Jail Group. He had been central to it. Chief biochemist, appointed 17 years ago at the age of 31. Lead researcher on a classified medical division Evan had never heard of. Publication record suppressed under corporate confidentiality agreements. Commendations. Internal awards. A photograph, and this was the one that made Evan's hand move involuntarily toward the screen and then stop, of a younger Dr. Ryu Timin standing in a laboratory, smiling at something off camera, looking nothing like the careful, exhausted man Evan had grown up with. He had never seen his father look like that. Unguarded. Unafraid. "He identified something in my bloodline," Han said, from behind him, voice measured and deliberate as a man reading from a document he'd memorized. "A condition. Rare. Specific to certain alpha lineages. He was the first researcher to isolate it, map it, begin developing a treatment protocol. A pause. He was also the first to understand what the protocol required. Evan turned from the tablet. What does that mean? It means his research made certain people inside this company very interested in a different application. Han's jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in his composure Evan had seen since waking. Not a treatment. A weapon. A controllable biological dependency they could use to manage alpha executives, competitors, anyone inconvenient. My father's enemies. Eventually my father himself. The silence in the room rearranged itself into something heavier. Your father found out, Evan said slowly, about what they were planning to do with his research. He sent an internal warning to my father, who was CEO at the time, and who he believed he could trust. He was wrong about that. Within 48 hours, your father's laboratory access was revoked. His personnel file was flagged. Han looked at him steadily. He disappeared before they could do anything more permanent. He took his infant son and every physical copy of his research and he vanished. Evan stood very still. His father had told him, in pieces over the years, that they'd left Seoul because of trouble with an employer. That the work had become dangerous. That some things were better buried. He'd framed it with the weary practicality of a man who'd made a hard choice and moved on. He had not said, I worked for the empire that is currently keeping you employed. He had not said, the man whose floors you mop may be dying because of what I discovered. He had not said, I erased your name to protect you from something I never fully explained. Evan looked at the photograph of his father one more time, young, unguarded, standing in a jail group laboratory, and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that the life he thought he'd inherited had roots he'd never been shown. He never told me, Evan said. Quietly. Not to Han. Not to Jisoo. Just to the room. Just to the fact of it. Han said nothing. For once, that was the right response. The physician's name was Dr. Shin Woo-jin, and he had the particular manner of someone who had delivered devastating news so many times that he developed an entire second personality to carry it, calm, precise, almost gentle, like a hand placed carefully on a surface that might shatter. He returned to the room with a second chair, which told Evan this was going to take a while. Evan Saturday. Not because he wanted to. Because his legs had made a quiet executive decision on his behalf. Han remained in the bed, positioned slightly away, giving Evan the room's center, which felt deliberate. Jisoo stood near the door with his hands clasped and his expression set to professionally neutral. Dr. Shin arranged a small projected display on the table between them, pulled up a diagram that looked like a biological cascade map, and folded his hands. What I'm about to explain, Dr. Shin said, was first theorized 40 years ago and formally documented by one researcher. Your father. So some of this may feel, eventually, familiar in ways that are difficult. Evan said nothing. He looked at the diagram. Begin, Han said from behind them. Bloodlock. Dr. Shin used the clinical term designation cascade failure, then used bloodlock again almost immediately because that was clearly what everyone in this room called it, was not a disease in the conventional sense. It didn't arrive from outside the body. It was written into certain alpha bloodlines at the genetic level, dormant for generations, triggered by a convergence of factors that Dr. Ryu Timin had spent years trying to map. The mechanism was this: in affected alphas, the biological systems governing scent bonding, the same systems that in healthy alphas simply governed attraction and pair bonding, were structurally dependent on a specific external signal to remain stable. Without that signal, the cascade began. Slowly at first. Elevated inflammatory markers. Compromised immune response. Progressive organ stress. The body essentially turning against its own alpha biology, the way our immune system sometimes turned on the body it was meant to protect. The signal, Dr. Shin said carefully, is scent-based. Produced only by a specific omega genetic profile. Not common. Not findable through standard matching registries because the markers involved are rarely tested for. He paused. Your father called it the counterscent. The biological answer to the cascade. In its presence, the bloodlock progression halts. With sufficient proximity over time, and eventually a full bond scent exchange, the damage already sustained can be significantly reversed. Evan was looking at the cascade diagram. He traced the progression line with his eyes, the slow, documented deterioration, the organ systems marked in graduated severity, and thought about Han in the plaza, hand pressed to his chest, fighting to stay upright. Thought about the twice-weekly medical visits he'd observed from the ventilation corridor on floor 12. Thought about how long that progression line was. How much of it was already behind them. How long has he had it? Evan said. Dr. Shin glanced at Han. Han said, 3 years diagnosed. Longer untreated. And the counter sent. Evan kept his voice level. My father isolated the genetic marker for it. He did. It took him nearly a decade. Dr. Shin's voice held something that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite grief. He identified the profile, developed a protocol for the Bonsent procedure, and documented everything in research that was, as you now know, subsequently buried. A pause. The profile he isolated is present in your biological registry. Filed at your birth, before your records were restructured. You carry it. The room was very quiet. Evan looked at the cascade diagram for a long moment. Then he looked at Han, really looked, the way he'd been carefully avoiding since he sat down. Han looked back at him without apology, without performance. Just that same consuming steadiness, the weight of a man who had already made his peace with what he needed and was waiting to see what Evan would do with that information. Evan turned back to Dr. Shin. The Bonsent procedure, he said. What does it involve? Dr. Shin explained it. Clinically, carefully, with the compassion of someone who understood that the clinical framing was the only version Evan would accept right now. It was not instantaneous. It was not simply proximity, though proximity helped, and would slow the cascade in the interim. The full procedure was medically supervised, required Evan's active and ongoing participation, and carried its own biological consequences for the omega involved. Not dangerous, with proper monitoring. Not without effect, either. Evan listened to all of it without interrupting. When Dr. Shin finished, the room waited. Evan was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the medical equipment's soft persistent rhythm became audible again. He was thinking about his father's photograph. The unguarded smile. The laboratory he'd never known about. The letter he hadn't yet read. He was thinking about a man who had discovered something extraordinary and spent the rest of his life running from it, and a son who had spent 4 years learning to do the same thing. He looked up. And if I say no? Dr. Shin didn't answer. Jizu didn't answer. Han didn't answer. The cascade diagram sat open on the table between them, its progression line ending in a single clinical notation that required no medical degree to interpret. The silence was its own answer. Evan looked at it for a long time. Then he stood, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and said, I need to think. Nobody stopped him from walking out. That, too, felt like its own kind of answer. He knew before he touched the door. The lock was re-engaged, whoever had come had been careful enough to reset it, but the handle had a faint smear on the underside that hadn't been there this morning, and Evan had lived carefully long enough to notice things like that. He stood in the hallway of his Mapo apartment building for 3 full seconds, listening to the specific quality of silence beyond the door, then pushed it open. They hadn't destroyed anything. That was almost worse. Destruction would have been emotional, anger, a message, someone making a point. This was surgical. Drawers replaced with millimeter imprecision, the slight wrongness of objects that had been lifted and returned by hands that weren't his. His father's single photograph, kept face down in the bottom of the wardrobe because that was the only way Evan could have it close without it costing him something every time he looked at it, had been turned face up. A reminder. We know what you have. We know what you are. His phone buzzed as he stood in the center of the room. Blocked number. A message, not a call, which told him whoever sent it was precise and unhurried. People who called were reactive. People who sent carefully worded texts at 9 in the evening had prepared them in advance. Return the card. Leave Seoul within 24 hours. This is a courtesy. The next contact will not be. Evan read it twice. Put the phone in his pocket. Stood in his methodically violated apartment and waited to feel afraid. The fear didn't come. What came instead was something colder and far more clarifying, The same sensation he'd had at 21 standing outside a government building with his father's death certificate in his hand, understanding that grief was a luxury he could process later and survival required him right now. His father had built their life on strategic retreat. Disappear. Reduce. Become nobody. It had worked for 17 years and it had ended with his father dying in a rented room with a stripped name and research he'd never been able to finish. Evan picked up his jacket. He was not his father's retreat strategy. Jail Tower at midnight looked like a different building. The commercial lighting was off, the plaza empty, the armored car long gone. Evan used the staff entrance on the east side. His employee badge still worked, which meant either Jizza hadn't thought to deactivate it or had deliberately left it active, and took the regular elevator to floor 20, the highest his badge would reach. The stairwell door to the rooftop was unlocked. He found Han at the north railing, facing the city. Dark coat over his medical suite clothes, Evan recognized the shirt collar, hands resting on the railing without gripping it. From behind, in the wind, he looked entirely like what he was supposed to be, untouchable. Monolithic. A man at the top of everything. Then he shifted his weight, slightly, redistributing it in a way that had nothing to do with the wind, and Evan understood he was watching someone manage pain quietly, the way people do when they've had a long time to practice. Han didn't turn around. I heard the door. I wasn't hiding, Evan said. He crossed the rooftop and stopped a few meters from the railing. The city spread beneath them, a lit geometry extending in every direction, indifferent and enormous. Somewhere in it, someone with a blocked number was waiting to see if their message had worked. My apartment was searched, Evan said. I received a message telling me to return the card and leave Seoul. I know. Han's voice was level. Jizoo flagged the security breach 40 minutes ago. We're identifying the access point. So you knew before I came back? Yes. Evan absorbed that. Were you going to tell me? Han was quiet for a moment. I was considering how. It wasn't the answer of a man who had been planning to hide it. It was the answer of a man unaccustomed to owing anyone an explanation, learning in real time that he owed this one. Evan found that fractionally more acceptable than a practiced response would have been. He moved to the railing. Stood beside Han, not close, but parallel, and looked at the city. Your father's research, Han said, after a silence that had settled into something less combative than their previous ones. The faction that buried it, they had his laboratory access revoked and his findings sealed before he fled. When he disappeared, they assumed the research disappeared with him. A pause. They've spent 17 years making sure no one asked questions. Your reappearance, your presence in this building, means the question is alive again. Evan said, you knew he worked here. Before tonight. I knew a researcher named Ryu Timan had identified bloodlock in my bloodline and then vanished. I didn't know he had a son. I didn't know that son had been working in my building for 8 months. Han turned his head and looked at Evan directly. I didn't know about your father. What was done to him, what was done to his work, I didn't know. The wind moved between them. That isn't an excuse. It's just true. Evan looked back at the city. His father had trusted the wrong person once and spent the rest of his life paying for it. Evan had spent 4 years learning not to trust anyone at all. He wasn't ready to call this trust. But standing here, at 3 in the morning, with the city spread below and danger already inside his apartment, he recognized something in Han Lee that he hadn't expected to find. Not safety. Something more honest than safety. A man who was also running out of time, telling the truth because he had nothing left to spend on anything else. Tell me about the faction, Evan said. Han turned back to the city. And began. The server room was in the basement of Jail Tower's east wing, behind a door that required both a keycard and a 6-digit code. Jizoo provided both without comment, led Evan down 2 flights of stairs that smelled of recycled air and old infrastructure, and stopped outside the door. The archive is partitioned, Jizoo said. 17 years of institutional sediment on top of it. Your father was thorough, the encryption is layered, and the outer shell has defeated every attempt we've made to access it. He paused. Han believes you may be able to open it. Because my father encrypted it. Because of how your father encrypted it. Jizoo swiped them through. Set up a terminal in the corner, navigated 3 levels of server architecture with the efficiency of a man who had clearly mapped this route in advance, and pulled up a black access screen with a single blinking prompt. Archive RYD // designation, sealed / password required. Then Jesus stood, straightened his jacket, and said, "I'll be outside." Evan looked at him. "Hands instruction," Jesus said, with the slight inflection of a man conveying something his employer hadn't explicitly stated but had made clear by other means. "You read it first. Alone." The door closed behind him. Evan sat in front of the terminal in the cold recycled air and looked at the password prompt for a long moment. His father had been 31 when he filed this archive. Evan had been approximately 7 years old enough to have a nickname, young enough that his father would have considered it secure. Something no institutional search would locate. Something that existed only between the two of them. His father had called him by all star. A private thing, used only at home, only in quiet moments, when his father tucked him in, or found him awake past midnight, or wanted to soften bad news into something a child could carry. Evan had forgotten, or tried to, because remembering it was one of the things that cost too much. He typed it. Archive unlocked. 847 files. Last modified, 17 years ago. He read for 2 hours and 14 minutes. The first several hundred files were what Dr. Shin had described: research documentation, clinical trial frameworks, the meticulous architecture of a decade's work. His father's scientific mind was evident in every line, precise, skeptical of its own conclusions, rigorous in a way that made Evan understand where his own habit of double-checking everything had come from. Not paranoia. Methodology. The bloodlock research was extraordinary. Even reading without a biochemist training, Evan could follow the logic of it, the way his father had mapped the cascade mechanism, identified the countersent markers, developed the bond-sent protocol step by careful step. It was the work of someone who had understood they were documenting something that might save a life, possibly many lives, and had refused to be careless with it. Embedded in the final research folder, filed under a name that looked like a data log, notes_personal_final, was the last thing his father had written before he fled. It was addressed, "For Bio, if you ever find this. I hope you never need to." Evan read it straight through without stopping. His father wrote the way he had spoken, economically, without performance, with occasional dry precision that in a different context might have been humor. He explained what he had found. What he had understood was being planned. The internal warning he had sent and the speed with which it had been used against him. The 3 names, board members who had been present at the meeting where weaponization was first discussed, who had moved against Dr. Ryu within hours of his warning, who had the authority and motivation to ensure the research stayed buried. Chairman Bae Chansik. Director Omansu. Executive Vice President Lim Sungo. His father had written, "These men are not criminals in the way that looks like crime. They are the kind of men who sign documents and attend dinners and let other people do the parts that cannot be signed. Be careful of the ones whose hands stay clean." The letter did not end with comfort. His father hadn't been a man who offered comfort he couldn't guarantee. It ended with this: "I hid you because I was afraid. I want you to know that hiding you was the right decision and that I would make it again. I also want you to know that you were never meant to stay hidden forever. You are your own evidence, by all. Whatever they erased, you exist." That was always enough. Evan sat in the cold server room and finished reading. He sat with it for a moment, the whole weight of it, his father's voice in written form, the research and the names and the last line especially. Then he let himself cry. Briefly, privately, in the way he did everything, without performance, without waste. When he was finished he wiped his face, straightened in the chair, and opened a new document. He typed the 3 names from memory. Bae Chansik. Omansu. Lim Sungo. He checked the current jail group board registry, accessible from the terminal, public record, and confirmed what his father had feared 17 years ago would still be true. All 3 were still active. Still powerful. Still present at every board meeting, every signed document, every dinner where decisions got made at the level where hands stayed clean. And according to Jizzo's security report from tonight, the one Han had referenced on the rooftop, at least one of them now knew that the Omega they had missed was no longer missing. Evan looked at the three names for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Jizu. "I have what we need," he said. "Come in." It happened on a Thursday. Evan knew it was Thursday because he had been in Jail Tower's F-21 medical suite for 6 days by then, a provisional arrangement Jizu had framed as a security measure and Han had framed as nothing at all, simply presenting Evan with a guest suite on the penthouse floor as though the offer required no justification. Evan had accepted because his Mapo apartment had been compromised and because Dr. Shin had confirmed that even passive proximity to Evan was measurably slowing Han's cascade progression. The science was real. That made it a practical decision. He had been telling himself it was a practical decision for 6 days. He was on the tower's rooftop garden, his thinking place now, apparently, a fact he had not consciously decided, when Jizu called. Han collapsed at the board dinner. "We're 40 minutes out." The poison wasn't crude. That was Dr. Shin's first observation, delivered with the grim respect of someone acknowledging a skilled opponent. It wasn't designed to kill Han directly. That would have been too visible, too immediately attributable. It was a bloodlock accelerant. A compound that targeted the specific biological systems already compromised by the cascade and pushed the progression forward by an estimated 3 to 4 months in a single dose. Whoever had designed it knew exactly what Han had. Knew the mechanism. Knew where to press. Be careful of the ones whose hands stay clean. Han was conscious when they brought him in, barely, and fighting the barely with the specific stubbornness of a man who considered unconsciousness a personal failure. He tracked Evan's presence in the room immediately, which Dr. Shin said was the countersent response functioning exactly as documented. His vitals, which had been deteriorating rapidly in the 40 minutes since exposure, began stabilizing within 8 minutes of Evan entering. 8 minutes. Evan stood at the far side of the room and watched the monitor lines smooth incrementally and felt something he had no useful name for. "The proximity effect is stronger than our baseline reading suggested," Dr. Shin said quietly, beside him. "The cascade is responding to your presence at a significant rate." He paused. "Mr. Han cannot be left alone, Evan. Not right now. Not until we understand the full scope of what was introduced tonight." "How long?" Evan said. 10 days minimum. Possibly longer." Evan looked at Han in the bed, jaw set, eyes closed now, the fight temporarily suspended. He looked like what he was, a man whose body was losing a war his will refused to acknowledge. "Fine," Evan said. 10 days. They moved Han to the penthouse suite that night. "Better air circulation," Dr. Shin said. "More space for monitoring equipment." The medical team rotated in 6-hour shifts. Evan's presence was the constant. The first 3 days were clinical. Evan read, worked through his father's research files on a tablet Jizu provided, slept in the adjoining room with the connecting door open as Dr. Shin requested. Han slept more than he would have liked. Evan could tell by the quality of his wakefulness, the slight irritation that accompanied every return to consciousness, as though sleep was something being done to him rather than something he was choosing. On the 4th day Han started staying awake longer. They didn't talk much. Evan had work. He was cross-referencing his father's notes against the board faction's documented movements, building a timeline Jizu could use, and Han had whatever Han did when he was supposed to be resting, which appeared to involve reading case files on his phone with the stubborn focus of a man refusing to accept that he was temporarily incapacitated. They occupied the same space in parallel. Occasionally one of them said something. The other responded. The silences between were not comfortable exactly, but they had stopped being combative, and that was its own kind of progress. On the 7th day it rained. Evan was at the window when Han woke from an afternoon rest, a genuine one this time, not medicated, the kind that followed real exhaustion, and for a few minutes neither of them acknowledged the other. Just the rain against the glass and the city below and the monitors measuring what Evan's proximity was doing to Han's biology in real time. "You didn't leave," Han said. "I said 10 days. You said fine. That isn't the same as wanting to stay." Evan turned from the window. Han was looking at him with that consuming steadiness, but there was something different in it now, worn down to something more exposed, the way prolonged proximity strips the performance from people whether they intend it or not. "I'm still here," Evan said. "That's its own answer." Han was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father's board installed those 3 men. He trusted them the same way your father trusted mine. A pause, the weight of inheritance, of sins that descended. We are both paying for what our fathers couldn't finish. Evan sat down in the chair beside the bed. Not close, but closer than clinical distance. On the 10th night, Han set down his phone and looked at Evan across the low light of the suite and said, with the quiet directness of a man who had spent 10 days deciding whether to say it. You don't have to save me, Evan. I want you to choose to. Evan looked at him for a long time. Outside, the city continued its indifferent geometry. Inside, something that had been suspended between them for 10 days settled, not into an answer, not yet, but into the honest acknowledgement that the question was real, and that Evan was no longer pretending otherwise. I know, he said. And that was enough, for tonight. Evan told Dr. Shin on the 11th day. Not Han first. Han would have made it about gratitude, or obligation, or the careful management of what Evan was agreeing to, and Evan didn't want any of those conversations. He wanted the clinical one. The one where someone walked him through exactly what would happen to his body, in sequence, without softening any of it, and let him make the decision with full information and no audience. Dr. Shin did exactly that. It took 90 minutes. Evan asked 14 questions, several of which visibly surprised the physician, specific, technical questions drawn from his 2 weeks with his father's research files. By the end Dr. Shin was answering him as a peer, which was the only register Evan had been willing to accept from the beginning. The procedure is in 3 stages, Dr. Shin said, at the close. Each stage requires your active consent at the time. You can stop after the first stage, or the second. The third stage is the full consent exchange and it is not reversible in the way the earlier stages are. I need you to understand that clearly. I understand it, Evan said. Once the third stage is complete, your biology will carry a permanent marker. It won't control you. It won't compel behavior. But it will be there. I know. Evan looked at his father's research notes, open on the tablet beside him. He documented that. He was very careful to document that. Dr. Shin was quiet for a moment. He was a thorough man. Yes, Evan said. He was. He scheduled the procedure for the following morning and went to find Han. Han was at his desk, actually at his desk, upright, reviewing documents, which represented a significant improvement from 10 days ago and still concerned Dr. Shin, who had strong opinions about rest that Han continued to treat as suggestions. He looked up when Evan came in. Evan stood in the doorway. Tomorrow morning, he said. I've scheduled it with Dr. Shin. Han set down the document. Something moved through his expression, not relief, not quite, something more complicated than relief. The expression of a man receiving news he had wanted and wasn't sure he deserved. Evan. I'm not doing this because I was cornered, Evan said. I want that clear. I've read my father's research. I understand the procedure. I understand what it means for my biology afterward. He met Han's eyes steadily. I'm choosing it. That's the only version of this I'm willing to be part of. Han held his gaze for a long moment. I know, he said. That's the only version I'd accept. Evan nodded once. Turned to leave. Evan. Han's voice, something in it that wasn't command, wasn't strategy, wasn't the consuming assessment Evan had grown used to. Something plainer than all of that. Thank you. Evan didn't turn back. But he stood in the doorway for one extra beat before he left. That night, Jizu came to Evan's room at 11 p.m. with a tablet and a look that meant the other thing was moving. Han authorized the action for tonight, Jizu said. While attention is on the procedure tomorrow. The faction will be expecting us to be occupied. That's why he scheduled it this way, Evan said. Not a question. Han has been building the evidentiary case for 4 months. Your father's files completed it, the 3 names, the documented timeline, the original communication chain that proves foreknowledge of your father's targeting. Jizu's expression was as neutral as always, but there was something underneath it that Evan had learned, in 2 weeks of proximity, to read as satisfaction. By morning it will be done. Evan thought about 3 men who had attended dinners and signed documents and kept their hands clean for 17 years. Good, he said. The procedure began at 7 a.m. in the F-21 medical suite, with 2 of Dr. Shin's most trusted staff and no one else present. Han was positioned in the adjoining space for the first two stages, close enough for the biological response to function, separated by a partition that Dr. Shin had been specific about for the integrity of each stage. It was not painless. Evan had prepared for that, and it was still not painless. The first stage was manageable. The second stage was the one that required him to be still and focused in a way that took everything he had, his designation fully present and unblocked for the first time in 4 years, his body responding to Han's proximity through the partition in ways that were documented, clinical, and also completely unlike anything Evan had experienced before. He breathed through it. Methodically. His father's notes had described this stage as the body recognizing what it was always meant to find. Evan had read that line twice and filed it under observations he would process later. The third stage he walked into with his eyes fully open. It worked. The monitors confirmed it before Dr. Shin said a word, the readings shifting in real time, Han's cascade indicators reversing their progression with a clarity that made the physician sit down and press his hand over his mouth for a moment in a way that had nothing to do with clinical detachment. By 8:45, Han walked through the partition under his own power and stood in front of Evan, and Evan looked up at him from the procedure chair, exhausted and present and entirely himself, designation and name and history intact. "Well," Evan said. Han looked at him, at all of him, the blue uniform cleaner and the researcher's son and the Omega who had chosen this, and said nothing for a moment. Then, Jizu just confirmed. "All three are in custody." Evan closed his eyes briefly. By noon, for the first time in a year, Han Li was breathing without medical assistance. Evan sat in the procedure chair and let himself feel, for one unguarded moment, exactly what he felt. It was not a small thing. 3 days after the procedure, when Dr. Shin confirmed Han's cascade markers had stabilized and the reversal was holding, Evan packed the bag he'd brought from Mapo and told Jizu he was leaving. Jizu received this information with his customary neutrality. "I'll arrange a car. I'll take the bus." A pause. "Han will want to." "Han can want things," Evan said pleasantly. "That's fine." He took the bus. The new apartment was in Mapo 2, 4 streets from the old one, not because Evan lacked options now, but because he'd chosen it before any of this happened, circled the listing on his phone during a lunch break 2 months ago when he'd let himself imagine, briefly, what a slightly better life might look like. 2 rooms instead of 1. A window that faced actual sky. A heating unit manufactured in this decade. He signed the lease under his real name. Evan Seoryu. The property agent typed it without reaction, because it was simply a name, because names were only weighted by the histories attached to them, and Evan had decided, in the procedure chair, in the server room, on the rooftop at 3 in the morning, that his history was not something to be filed under hidden. It was something to carry visibly, the way his father should have been allowed to carry his work. He hung nothing on the walls the first week. Let the space be empty in his and unhurried. On the 8th day he framed his father's photograph, the one from the jail group file, young and unguarded and smiling at something off camera, and put it on the shelf above his desk, face up. He stood back and looked at it for a while. "There," he said, to no one. To his father, maybe. Han came for the first time on a Wednesday, 11 days after Evan left the tower. No call. No message. Evan opened the door to find him standing in the hallway in a dark coat, looking slightly less like a man at war with his own body than he had for the past several months, holding 2 coffees from the place on the corner that Evan had mentioned, once, in passing, during the 10 days of proximity. Evan stared at him. "You remembered the coffee shop," Evan said. "I remember most things." "You didn't call ahead." "No." Evan looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had handed him a card in a plaza and said "Don't run," who had told the truth when lying would have been easier, who had said "I want you to choose to instead of making the choice irrelevant." Who was standing in his hallway in Mapo with 2 coffees like this was a simple thing. Evan stepped back from the door. Han came in. He came back the following Wednesday. And the one after that. Always without calling ahead, which Evan found irritating in a way that was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from something else entirely. He said so, on the 4th visit. "You could send a message. 1 message. It takes 4 seconds." "It does," Han agreed. And yet, Han said, with the slight inflection of a man who had decided this particular argument was more interesting than it was worth resolving. Evan looked at him. Han looked back. The apartment held the familiar quality of their silences, not combative anymore, not clinical, just two people who had learned each other's rhythms and found them, against all reasonable probability, compatible. Evan handed him a case file Jizu had forwarded. Han read it. The evening continued. 6 months after the procedure, on a Thursday in early spring, Evan sat on his couch with his laptop open to the Journal of Designation Biology's current issue. His father's research had been formally resubmitted 4 months ago, the full bloodlock documentation, properly credited to Dr. Ryu Timin, restored to the scientific record after a review process that Evan had been quietly, precisely, immovably present for at every stage. The publication had gone live that morning. He read his father's name in the author line 3 times. Han was beside him on the couch, close enough that Evan was aware of him, which was simply biology now, acknowledged and unremarkable, reading a brief on the restructured jail group board. Bae Chunsik, Oh Mansu, and Lim Sungo had been formally indicted 6 weeks after their arrest. The trial was pending. Their replacements on the board had been selected with Jizu's characteristically thorough vetting process and Han's final approval. The apartment was warm. The heating unit worked. Outside the window, actual sky, pale spring, the kind of evening that didn't ask anything of anyone. Han glanced over at Evan's screen. Saw the journal. Saw the name in the author line. He said nothing. But his hand, resting on the couch between them, moved, a small shift, unhurried, no performance, until the back of it was against Evan's. Not a claim. Just a presence. Just I'm here. Evan looked at his father's name in print for a 4th time. Then he turned the page. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. This was not the dramatic pivot or the sweeping declaration. Those moments had come and gone, in server rooms and procedure chairs and rooftop gardens at 3 in the morning. This was what came after all of that. Ordinary. Chosen. Quietly, stubbornly real. The kind of beginning neither of them had expected to survive long enough to have, and both of them, now, intended to keep.